of this course. And you can see here we have relatively a simple outdoor scene. So sort of a patio with a couple of chairs, sort of a back pool here, the back side of the house, and a few trees. So we're going to go through the whole process of setting up lights, materials, textures, and everything that we need to make this scene really come alive. Now, before we start with the actual light setup, I want to point out just a few things that I usually try to do before I really even start with my lighting. Just a few things to keep in mind. Number one is when it comes to actually modeling and building out the scene, one of the things that can really help sell this scene as being something that is absolutely real is to start to think about maybe just a few little additional details in your scene. So for example, we have things like this little power outlet that are connected to the wall. We also have things like this little towel that's draped over the chair. Now, these may seem like really simple, just very inconsequential things, but they actually do a very important job of sort of anchoring this scene in reality. These are a couple things that, if we saw this big wall along the patio, we would probably expect to see some kind of a power outlet for stereo, for anything that you might want to plug in outside. Also, by just throwing a little bit of a towel over here, we start to give the scene a little bit more of a lived-in feel and not something that's quite so empty and so cold. These are things that your eye probably won't even notice whenever you see them, but by not having them there, it just feels like something is maybe missing from the scene as a whole. So just throwing in a couple of these little elements, again, while it may not seem like such a big deal, believe me, it will make a big impact later on. The other thing that I like to do is very early on, really even before I start to set up my lighting, is I try to settle on some kind of a camera angle. So if I press the C key on my keyboard, you can see I already have a camera in here that's been set up. So if I switch this to a shaded view, you can see that. Now what this does is it's just going to really just kind of take a lot of the guesswork out of my lighting. So instead of trying to set up your lights early on and trying to make your lights look good from every conceivable angle, just start by trying to settle on some kind of a camera position. And in that way you really just have to focus on getting your lights to look really great from a particular angle. Because what happens is you can wind up wasting a lot of time trying to get your lights to look good from angles that you may never even see at the end of the day. So just settling on a camera angle early on is going to make sure that we don't create a lot of unnecessary work for ourselves further down the road. So those are just a couple things that I always try to keep in mind before I even begin with my lighting. So with that in mind, let's go ahead and start with our initial light setup. So because this is an outdoor scene, I find that a good place to start is with just a basic sun or a daylight setup. So before I actually render though, I'm going to drop in just a basic gray material for these objects, so that way we don't have to see a whole lot of multicolored objects in here. So I'm going to jump into my render setup over in my common tab, scroll down, let's expand this rollout down at the bottom, and let's set our renderer to mental ray. There we are. So that's the first thing I'm going to do. The second thing is, as I just mentioned, I'll drop in some kind of a material on top of everything. Usually a gray material I find is something good to start with. So in my material editor, just right click, go to materials, I'll drop in a mental ray material, and I always like to stick with the architectural and design materials. These have a way of actually interacting with light in a much more physically accurate way. And they also have some built-in features, which I'll talk about a little bit later, that I really like. So as a matter of personal preference, I almost use exclusively the architectural and design materials. So I'm going to drop this in and set its reflectivity all the way down to 0, so that way we don't have to worry about something that's overly shiny. Now let's pull back, try to get everything in here. With everything selected, we can grab this material and drop it onto our selection. Okay, so with that, if we were to come in and just simply render out an image, Shift-Q on my keyboard is going to be the shortcut that I'm using. So we have now this nice flat gray image. What I will go ahead and do is set my camera to be my rendered view. So again, press the C key on my keyboard, go back to my rendered frame window, You can see now my viewport is set to camera 001. And I'll go ahead and lock this down so that way anytime I hit render, it will always render from my camera view. Okay, so now let's get into just a very, very quick light setup to begin with. Like I said, I'm going to start with the daylight, so let's go to Create, Systems, and we'll drop in a daylight system. Okay, it's going to set up a photographic exposure control. Because I've already set my renderer to mental ray, it's going to now drop in a mental ray photographic exposure. So we'll go ahead and click yes, and now we get to create the daylight system. So we start by just drawing out our compass. So from the top view, I'm just going to draw this out. And once I let off my mouse, now I can position the sun. So left click, and when I'm done, just right click to stop my creation process. And we can see our daylight system has now been created. So again, if I press Shift Q on my keyboard, we can start to see what this daylight looks like. So now we have some a little bit nicer shadows, but overall this is not quite what I want. So if I select my daylight system here, go into my modifiers, I'm going to make a few quick adjustments. So I'm going to set my sunlight to be a mental ray sun, and I'll set my skylight to be a mental ray sky. It's going to ask us to go ahead and create a physical sky environment. Let's click yes for that. And once again, Shift Q on my keyboard. And now you can see this starts to look a little bit better. Now we actually have some kind of a sky, a little bit more realistic look to this. So let's come in and make a few adjustments to the overall position of this. I'd like to change some of my shadow direction, some of my light direction on this. So we can do that very easily in our daylight system. So with the assembly head selected for our daylight, we can come in and set up a position. Now, depending on how precise we want to get, we can actually get in here and start to dial in certain hours of the day. So let's say I wanted my shot to be set sort of mid-afternoon, maybe about 3 o'clock in the afternoon. So I can set my time up to 1500 hours. In my case, this is middle of the year, so the 6th month. So this is going to be June 21st of the year 2001. So we can, again, get really precise on that as far as what time of the year we want our render to happen. Time zone, we have this set to -8, which would put us somewhere sort of on the west coast of the United States. And we can even get a little bit more precise than that with certain latitudes and longitudes. Now, this particular setting here would put us right around the San Francisco Bay area in California. Again, you can type this in if you want to have your renders happen from a certain part of the world, if you really do want to get that precise. Now, one area that you'll probably find very, very useful is this north direction. So I have everything set up for about 3 o'clock in the afternoon, but if you look at my render, the sunlight may not be coming quite from the direction that I want, so it's sort of coming from this sort of backward direction. Now, ideally, though, in my case, just as a matter of personal taste, I'd like to have my sunlight coming from this direction, so maybe making my house look like it's a little bit more westward facing. So what I can do is take this north direction, and as I move this around, you'll notice that it's moving this whole compass. So I can actually have this point in a different direction. So in my case, I'm going to swivel this around, so that way we're getting our light coming a little bit more from this direction. In my case, looks like somewhere around 210 to 220 degrees is going to be what I want. So once again, Shift Q to re-render this. There we go. That's now looking quite a bit better. Now, at the moment, in my particular instance, this overall lighting looks maybe a little bit too dim, maybe a little bit too dark. So if this were something that was going to be outdoor, we'd probably expect this to be quite a bit brighter. So we can come into our exposure control. So this is under the rendering menu, exposure control. We have our mental ray photographic exposure. We have all the presets that were automatically placed for us whenever we set this to a mental ray sun and a mental ray sky. So photographic exposure, exposure value of 15. Now if we want, we could come in here and let's first make sure we have the proper viewport activated. So we can just click somewhere here in this viewport to make sure our camera view is active. And let's come in and make some adjustments to our exposure. So let's start by doing a quick little render preview. So it gives us this little teeny tiny thumbnail of our render. Now with this set, what you'll notice is I can come in here and start to adjust these exposure values and actually get an idea of what this is going to look like for my final render. So in my case, it looks like something around an exposure value of 14 is going to be a little bit closer. So if I re-render this, there we are. Now you can see this is quite a bit brighter, a little bit closer to what I want. The nice thing is we can always come back and adjust this at any time that we want. So this is like a pretty good setup for just a very, very basic, rough setup for our light. There's probably quite a bit of work still that we would need to do. You'll notice, for example, if I were to get in a little bit closer, you can see that we don't have really good contact shadows at all in areas like these steps, in some of these plants. Really, again, just very, very basic. Now, we could come in and start to very easily introduce some more crisp indirect shadows, but the thing is that that's really going to start to slow down our renders. Now, when we're still this early along in our lighting process, we're really more concerned with speed, right? We want fast feedback so we can make these adjustments, see what it looks like, and then continue to tweak and adjust from there. So getting these much nicer shadowing effects are really just a matter of increasing some of our quality settings, so that's not going to be a problem at all to introduce these when the time is right. But for now, in the sake of speed, I'm going to refrain from doing that. Alright, so in our next lesson we'll continue along with some of this initial light setup, and I'll also talk about some of these little errors like this towel where it looks like part of it may have disappeared, so we'll talk about just what's causing this and how we can fix those things.